Hey Archaeofiends, Paul Edward here, and we have been celebrating here at Archaeofiend HQ on the 12th of June, 2023, the Director General of UNESCO, that's the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, announced to representatives of 193 member states that the United States of America will be seeking to rejoin the organization after its withdrawal during the Trump presidency. And on the 30th of that month, in a 132-10 vote, the United States was accepted as the 194th member state of UNESCO. We're back, baby! So good job, Dark Brandon, on bringing the U.S. back into the organization so that way we can work together to support education and research, sustainability, development, and cultural heritage around the world in the spirit of camaraderie. I'm sure that's nothing. So, to commemorate this historic news, this video is going to discuss UNESCO, its mission and history, and especially its World Heritage listings. Nothing controversial here. You might have heard of this small international organization called the United Nations. And of course, it came into being at the end of the Second World War.
But then an even greater force emerged. The Un. And the Un un-Nazi'd the world forever.
Yeah, just like that. And with the creation of the UN, several agencies with their own specific focuses soon came into being, or were inherited by the UN. So for example, we have the International Labour Organization, the World Bank, the World Health Organization, and the Industrial Development Organization. Now, UNESCO was established early on with its first establishing conference ending on the 16th of November of 1945. Now, this agency had a precursor within the UN's deadbeat dad, the League of Nations, called the International Committee on Intellectual Cooperation. Founded in 1922, this organization had the goal to foster exchanges and international cooperation between scientists, researchers, teachers, and artists. And it had several subcommittees like on museums, art and literature, and on intellectual rights. And the ICIC attracted some famous nerds from that time. Now, you might notice one in this picture. So if you guessed Nito Binazo, then... well, that's not really who I was going to talk about, but good effort. Albert Einstein served as an esteemed member of the committee, but publicly resigned in 1923, just a year after its founding, criticizing the organization for doing very little to actually meet its mission. And German nationalists, well, anti-Semites, used this resignation to fuel their own agendas, nationalism and anti-Semitism, and this ultimately prompted Einstein to return to the organization in 1924. Despite his return to the committee, Einstein's criticisms weren't exactly wrong, and in a seeming effort to address ICIC's inefficacy, an executive branch of the organization was opened in 1926 in the Palais Royal in Paris, called the International Institute of Intellectual Cooperation. The establishment of this new executive ended up causing friction within the League of Nations. The IC almost exclusively was funded by the French government, and it held a fairly autonomous status. And all three of the directors of the organization were French. Not really the kind of cooperation we were looking for here, buddy. Starting in 1928, ICIC also worked closely with another League of Nations agency, the International Educational Cinematographic Institute, that was financed and operated by the Italian government and headquartered in Rome. Mussolini, of course, had a keen interest in the use of cinema for fascist propaganda. The Istituto Luce opened in 1924, Luce both meaning light and also being an acronym for this, or in English, the Educational Film Union. Now, when Luce opened, it used this image and slogan. Now, am I saying that the ICIC was actively supporting of fascism? No, I don't think so. But what I am saying is that this organization had a lot of problems, like the League of Nations, especially with coordinating actions and cooperation. The solution of creating bodies that are funded and operated almost exclusively by the government of one state isn't really a good one, because what would stop that government from using that entire agency and its authority disproportionately in the service of their own national state purposes? The International Committee on Intellectual Cooperation held its last plenary in 1939, what with the whole global conflict thing. But it only actually dissolved as an organization in 1946, with its mission passing on to UNESCO. With World War II having only just ended, the mission of UNESCO seemed really urgent in its mission of peace. The president of the organizing conference held in London, Helen Wilkinson, the British Minister on Education, read the agency's preamble. The political mission of peace, understanding, cooperation, diversity, and respect are fundamental to UNESCO, and we have to appreciate that gathering people from vastly different cultures to come together and encourage the dialogues and diplomacy that are necessary to the organization's missions is not going to be an easy thing. And UNESCO works on thousands of projects, and for the 2-year period of 2022 and 2023, it's funding 1,756 projects across 170 countries. And those are only projects that have clear dates of completion, so that figure doesn't actually include very long-term, ongoing initiatives. And that all comes with a pretty hefty price tag. The operating budget for 2022 and 2023 is 1.5 billion USD, which is collected through contributions by member states, both an annual assessed contribution and, for some countries, a voluntary contribution. Currently, UNESCO's biggest contributor is China. Including the country's voluntary contribution, by the end of the first quarter of 2023, China had given UNESCO about $114.5 million, supporting 32 projects, the majority of those being educational projects. The next largest contribution is currently from Japan and then from Germany. This chart here takes data from slightly earlier sets, so that's why, for example, there's a little bit of a difference in China's contribution, but it's not really different enough to change too much of the information for our purposes right now. Since the US's departure from UNESCO on the 1st of January of 2019, and since we stopped paying our roughly $80 million annual contribution, China has held the top spot of contributors. It's a situation that the Biden administration found very concerning, especially with the organization's upcoming work regarding artificial intelligence and education initiatives like the establishment of the Teacher Education Center in Shanghai and a further proposal to establish a Category 1 STEM center as well. Those Category 1s are institutions that are deemed to be crucial to developing and advancing the mission of UNESCO, and as such are a formal part of the organization, and they also then have to comply with UNESCO's rules, while Category 2 institutions don't necessarily have to do that. Anyhow, these developments spurred the Biden administration to return to UNESCO to punk China. On the 26th of April, Secretary of State Antony Blinken said to the Senate Appropriations Committee in an appeal to get funding that we believe that having the waiver authority would be important and necessary, and I can say with authority that our partners in Israel feel the same way. They would support our rejoining UNESCO. And when we're not at the table shaping that conversation, and so actually helping to shape those norms and standards, well, someone else is, and that someone else is probably China. After appropriately scaring the Senate with a bit of yellow peril, a contribution was placed into the U.S. budget, which over the next few years will ultimately equal the sum of $616 million to cover our back pay, alongside a waiver to be legally allowed to renew contributions to UNESCO and re-enter the organization. And that waiver itself would need to be renewed by Congress in 2025. But why do we need a waiver in the first place? And why did we withdraw? The United States has had a tricky relationship with the United Nations and its agencies. A Gallup poll showed that at the start of 2023, 39% of the US public thought that the UN was doing a good job. About 59% of the US public felt that they could trust information from the WHO about the COVID pandemic, and 46% believed that the organization had an adequate or good response to the pandemic. And in the before times, we had a whole-ass president give a speech to the UN denouncing them as a bunch of vicious globalists. This awkward relationship between the US and the UN existed well before the US elected its first sentient jaundiced scrotum as president. And he wasn't even the first to take the United States out of UNESCO. That distinction belongs to another bag, Ronald Reagan. In 1984, the Reagan administration withdrew from UNESCO, accusing it of being financially inefficient and that it had also been politicized by radical left commies. And this administration accused UNESCO of promoting Soviet-style disarmament and a critique of free market capitalism in education programs, with Gregory J. Newell, the Assistant Secretary of State for International Organization Affairs, stating that the organization extraneously politicized virtually every subject it deals with, exhibits hostility towards the basic institutions of a free society, especially a free market and a free press, and that when UNESCO returns to its original purposes and principles, the United States would be in a position to return to UNESCO. The administration stated openly that it was a threat to all other organizations to fall in line with what the U.S. considered to be appropriate ideologies. The U.S. didn't re-enter UNESCO until September 2002 with an announcement by the Bush administration. And this was positioned as a way for the U.S. to get its way of being across to the rest of the world, to help shape education, and to steer the world towards democracy and freedoms, because those tourists hate our freedoms. And he said in a press conference in Czechia a few weeks after rejoining UNESCO that ours is a war against individuals who absolutely hate what America stands for and hate the freedom of the Czech Republic. And therefore, we must work together to defend ourselves, and by remaining strong and united and tough, we'll prevail. It was this diplomacy of unity through shared ideals of freedom that really seemed to appeal to the administration. Rejoining UNESCO was a way to conduct soft diplomacy for Bush and company while they were ramping up their efforts to plunge the US and the Middle East into decades of war. They lied about weapons of mass destruction to claim that Iraq violated UN Security Council 1441 and invade, all while working with UNESCO on missions of education, culture, understanding, and diplomacy. In unrelated news, Iraq is currently the largest beneficiary of UNESCO-funded programs, and Afghanistan is number 3, getting $84.9 million and $24.1 million respectively. The majority of those projects in Iraq going towards cultural goals, like the protection and preservation of its cultural heritage from things like wartime looting and destruction and, cultural repression by oppressive forces. Throughout this time, the U.S. worked through UNESCO to clean its image abroad while it waged its global war on terror. SEAL teams kicking down children's doors to execute closet monsters and blackbagging and waterboarding the Babadook in Guantanamo for information. And all the while doing this, it was the agency's largest contributor. But that changed quickly in 2011, and the U.S. withdrew all of its funding to UNESCO. In October of that year, in a 104-14 vote, Palestine was admitted as a member of UNESCO, largely so that way they could have a say in how educational and cultural projects impacted them, not being, at the mercy of, say, Israel or Lebanon and their projects. Acknowledgement of Palestine was something that the U.S. had not wanted for any organization, so the Foreign Relations Authorization Act fiscal years 1990-1991 stipulated that it would be illegal for the United States to give any money to any organization that did so, again, as a financial threat. So the Obama administration was obliged to withdraw all of its funding to UNESCO while staying as a member, but one without any voting power. The U.S. almost immediately lost most of its clout within UNESCO, And in that time, after them leaving, Palestine had 3 of its nominated sites listed as being part of World Heritage, and millions of dollars in projects to rebuilding infrastructure, doing cultural outreach, developing access to education, and focusing on gender equality. The Trump administration denounced the organization for its anti-Israel bias by promoting projects and sites in Palestine. The listing of the Old Town of Hebron, or Al-Khalil, which includes the Al-Ibrahimi Mosque and the Tomb of the Patriarchs, and placing it as a site under risk, proved to be incredibly controversial. Israel, for instance, felt that the wording of the resolution and listing of the site itself downplayed its Jewish heritage, while both Israel and the US denied that the actions of Israelis posed any risk to the integrity or safety of this site. In November of that year, the Trump administration formally recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, prompting a vote in the UN General Assembly, which came to a resolution with a vote of 151 to 6, saying that any actions by Israel, the occupying power, to impose its laws, jurisdiction, and administration on the holy city of Jerusalem were illegal, and therefore null and void. It further stressed the need for the parties to refrain from provocative actions, especially in areas of religious and cultural sensitivity, and called for the respect of the historic status quo at the holy places of Jerusalem. A further resolution, ES 10/L.22, condemned the action of the U.S., and all during this time, on the 12th of October, the United States announced its withdrawal from UNESCO once again, giving pretty much the same exact reasons that the Reagan administration used, except kind of switch out pro-Soviet for anti-Israel. Listing a site as being Palestinian and World Heritage in danger was a match that set off this powder keg. But what is World Heritage? One of the hallmarks of the UNESCO mission is the World Heritage Site List. This list has its origins in an international effort to protect heritage sites from destruction. In 1954, the Egyptian government began its plans for what would become the Aswan High Dam along the Nile River. Now, the trouble with this project that promised to control the river's flooding and drastically expand the country's agricultural output is that, over a couple thousand years, Egypt built things along the river. The Aswan High Dam would have destroyed some incredible pieces of ancient Egypt's monuments, and in 1960, UNESCO was called upon to save these endangered monuments, and so the international campaign to save the monuments of Nubia began. And this campaign lasted for 20 years and rescued some 22 monuments from destruction at about the cost of $80 million, with the support of 50 states. The success of this campaign, alongside a conference in 1965 at the White House, which called for a World Heritage Trust to preserve the world's superb natural and scenic areas and historic sites for the present and the future for the entire world's citizenry. And then another conference in 1968. This saw the organizing of a convention concerning the protection of the world cultural and natural heritage, or as we know it today, the World Heritage Convention in 1972, and the concept of the World Heritage Site itself. From that convention, sites were judged for containing cultural and natural heritage around the world considered to be of outstanding value to humanity. Member states select the sites that they think they should be listed, and that goes onto a tentative list based on a list of criteria. And in order to qualify, any of these tentative sites need to meet at least one of these now 10 criteria. Tentative sites for the World Heritage List must 1. Represent a masterpiece of human creative genius. 2. Exhibit an important interchange of human values over a span of time or within a cultural area of the world on developments in architecture or technology, monumental arts, town planning, or landscape design. 3. Bear a unique or at least exceptional testimony to a cultural tradition or to a civilization which is living or which has disappeared. 4. Be an outstanding example of a type of building, architectural or technological ensemble, or landscape which illustrates significant stages in human history. 5. be an outstanding example of a traditional human settlement, land use, or sea use, which is representative of a culture or cultures or human interaction with the environment, especially when it has become vulnerable under the impact of irreversible change. 6. To be directly or tangibly associated with events or living traditions, with ideas or beliefs, with artistic and literary works of outstanding universal significance. The committee considers that this criterion should preferably be used in conjunction with other criteria. 7. To contain superlative natural phenomena or areas of exceptional natural beauty and aesthetic importance. 8. To be outstanding examples of representing major stages of Earth's history, including the record of life, significant ongoing geological processes in the development of landforms, or significant geomorphic or physiographic features. 9. To be outstanding examples of representing significant ongoing ecological and biological processes in the evolution and development of terrestrial, freshwater, coastal, and marine ecosystems and communities of plants and animals. Or 10. To contain the most important significant natural habitats for in situ conservation of biological diversity, including those containing threatened species of outstanding universal value from the point of view of science and conservation. It was the second convention in 1978 that the list got its first 12 sites, and there were sites from Europe, 3 from Africa, 2 from Latin America, and 4 from Anglo-America. So not really the worst spread. Apologies to Asia. In the following year, 45 sites were listed. 20 of those were from Europe, 5 from France alone. And it's a little awkward that one of the first French sites to be listed was the Palace at Versailles. But who cares about optics, I guess? The process of nomination very quickly became a target of critique. The nomination of the historic city of Warsaw in 1980 forced the convention to question the criteria that UNESCO even uses in its listings. Now, I'll save that for another episode, but for a teaser, it involves Nazis and is the reason why Criterion 6 has that little bit in parentheses. So, member states have their own nominated sites placed onto tentative lists, waiting for their turn to then be nominated and listed as World Heritage. And they have to not only meet the criteria that I'd mentioned, but also logistical matters about the site, its safety and maintenance, and access. And this process can take years and a ton of money for lobbying to get that status, or, like in the case of Australia, to keep that status untarnished by being labeled at risk. Now, getting the designation is often considered an incredible benefit to tourism and a mark of pride, with people wanting to go to visit places that UNESCO has determined to be worthy of that World Heritage label. But that might actually do incredible damage to the site itself, strip the area of its resources, or overburden its infrastructure. And for impoverished places, they might not actually be able to support the tourism that could possibly help to strengthen their economies. So this is a status that's a difficult thing to attain for people in the global south, either on the basis of them not having funding for long listing campaigns, lacking the infrastructure needed to satisfy the needs of the site and tourism, or even the fact that for a very long time, agencies like UNESCO didn't consider the approaches of heritage in the same way that much of the world does, preferring a much more Eurocentric model to universal world heritage. Again, I will talk about things like that and authenticity more in another episode. Getting World Heritage status is a big business, and it does bring some perks to it, including access to international recognition and to support. A big reason for the listing of Hebron was to offer the Palestinian people an avenue to work against Israeli settlement and the military from, well, supporting the destruction of their buildings, businesses, livelihoods, and elements of their culture. So from that perspective, listing might be a really handy tool, but it's still one that's very unevenly distributed. As of this recording, there are 1,157 World Heritage sites across 167 states. Italy currently holds the most sites at 58, with China in second with 56, followed by Germany, then France and Spain. 6 of the top 10 states are in Europe. The Europe and North American region make up 47.2% of all listings. Asia and the Pacific have 23.9%, Latin America 12.6%, Africa 8.5%, and the Arab states with about 7.8%. And there hasn't actually been any real sign of this evening out anytime soon. Europe and North America has been the region with the most listings at all but 5 of these conventions. In the 1997 convention hosted by Italy, one European state saw 10 of its properties listed. I wonder what state that might have been. And then there's even the controversial cases for removal from the list, for having their universal qualities ruined in some fashion, or the debate that, maybe they shouldn't have been listed in the first place. León Viejo is a site in Nicaragua that was listed in the year 2000. And the site is particularly interesting because it was an early colonial settlement that never went on to be developed into any of those more modern, larger colonial cities in the Americas, because it was slammed by an earthquake and then covered by a volcano in 1610. And so from that, we have a pretty unique example of what earlier colonial settlements would have looked like in the mainland Americas. And that's pretty damned interesting. Still, I remember being privy to a discussion between a few cultural heritage specialists affiliated with UNESCO in the UK about 10 years ago, and the opinion that they had of the listing was that it watered down the value of a World Heritage listing, but they thought that it was kind of a favor to those poor countries. But there is this consideration of inappropriate listings, and while León Viejo really doesn't look spectacular or breathtaking, its story and the connection to that whole colonialism thing that dramatically shaped the world is certainly of universal quality. But then on the other hand, we have, for example, the old quarters and fortifications of Luxembourg, which were inscribed in 1994. And, they are quite pretty, and apologies to, the scores of rabid Luxembourgish fans of mine, but does the fact that they were rebuilt by several powerful European states make them universal value, rather than just really nifty military architecture? Or was it maybe more of a political and diplomatic choice to place them on this list? Obviously, all of this is political. The states themselves that are in power, in dominant power, make their own nominations and their tentative lists, and then put money and diplomatic efforts into getting the specific sites they want on the World Heritage List. What sites get picked and what don't, and who has the money and clout to see that through anyhow. In the United States, 2 spectacular Native American sites have been on the tentative list since 2008, and one of those sites was legally part of a golf course until last year. So how much effort has really been put into advancing that nomination on a federal level? Never mind the countless sites that settlers destroyed in the 17, 18, 1900s, and still. And UNESCO has the World Heritage in Danger list. Plenty of those sites are at risk as a direct result of Western destabilization. Let's just look at Iraq. That still needs millions of dollars in funding to preserve its heritage after decades of war. In this conversation about World Heritage, UNESCO, and being aligned with the mission, China takes this looming stage, one that's filled with danger and mistrust. Again, some yellow peril stuff. Not only is there the positioning that they're bad players, but also that they aren't even good stewards of their own heritage. Never mind the fact that 2 out of the 3 delisted World Heritage sites are in Europe. But somehow the China problem is then specifically marked as the failing of UNESCO for being unable to do anything, because China's apparently steering the ship now because they're writing the biggest checks. Who writes checks anymore? I mean, maybe of course if they're like those giant novelty checks, that'd be fun. With the US's re-entry into UNESCO, Dirk Brandon is looking to curb Chinese influence by once again throwing down the biggest of all novelty checks. And this return has been framed as a new field of conflict and tension, or even as a battleground where we need to fight back. But this really misses the mark, and I think so far as to not be properly approaching the mission of UNESCO in good faith. Even though his country voted against the U.S. returning, China's ambassador to UNESCO, Yong Jin, said that the absence of the U.S. from the organization had a negative impact on its work, and he appreciates the efforts of bringing them back in. Young also said that we hope the return of the U.S. this time means it acknowledges the mission and goals of the organization and is willing to adhere to true multilateralism and promote international cooperation. So yeah, a bit of shade, but he's not wrong. That's really the thing. This isn't a fight. This is not war, and not any kind of macho way. This is diplomacy, negotiation, and dialogue. Are there things about China that we can and should criticize? Abso-fucking-lutely. Just like there's plenty to criticize about the US or UNESCO, and don't get me started on them. But pointing fingers and walking away from the table just because you can't always get your way isn't an act of strength or strong character. It's what a kid does. And yeah, sure, every party wants to end up having won something that helps their people or their vision of their people, but that doesn't make it a competition where somebody has to lose. UNESCO is far from perfect, and its membership can be downright at times, but it does incredible work, necessary work. And a large part of that is to get all of these states with drastically differing cultures and views to work together, to cooperate towards shared goals of peacemaking and a better future. Tiny things like that. And if we want to not destroy ourselves and each other, and, then we're going to have to put some of our differences aside and negotiate. We're going to have to work together. No amount of rugged individualism will prevent or save us from the next global catastrophe. The only way we can, in the long term, survive and thrive is by being the social animals that we evolved to be and to cooperate. Hey, you. Yeah, you right there. Thanks for watching. I put a lot of work into these videos, and I really appreciate you taking the time out for that. I'd also really like to hear your thoughts. Do you have a favorite World Heritage Site, or maybe just one you'd like to know a little bit more about? Let me know in the comments. And also, if you haven't, maybe you can give this video a like and share it with people, on the bus or something. And if you haven't already, why not subscribe to the channel so that way you can stay up to date on all your Archaeofiend needs. Anyways, I'm Dr. Paul Edward Mongomery Ramirez, and I will catch you Archaeofiends later.